These are the official figures of the Scottish Government. In 2008-9, this is in real terms, comparing like with like, you had an overall budget of £35 billion. In real terms, this year, next year, you have an overall budget of just over £35 billion. In real terms, there's been no cut.
Okay, let's go back a little here, shall we? In this video clip, Andrew Neil, arguably one of the BBC's most experienced political commentators, asks SNP MP Angus Robertson about real terms cuts to the Scottish budget and implies that the current budget of 2015-16 of £35 billion is no different to the budget of 2008-2009, which was also £35 billion, and thus that there has been no real terms cut by the UK government to Scotland's block grant. Putting aside for the moment the very obvious question as to why after 7 or 8 years the Scottish budget has not actually increased by inflationary pressures alone, let us look a little deeper into Andrew Neil's figures. If we consider the official figures published by the Scottish Government for 2015-16, what we in fact find is indeed a real terms cut of 10% to the Scottish Government's budget, shown at the bottom right of the image here. This 10% cut to Scotland's block grant is confirmed in this report by the independent think tank Fiscal Affairs Scotland, who in their most recent report write, at present 2014-15, the real terms cut since 2009-10 stands at minus 10%. However, when this very obvious fact was pointed out to Andrew Neil, the BBC's top political commentator was having none of it and insisted that his figure was correct. Scotland's budget had not been cut under the Tories. His figure of £35 billion was right and that everyone else was wrong. He even sent a tweet to the Reverend Stuart Campbell of the independent supporting website Wings Over Scotland, who had debunked Neil's original claim. Mr Neil told the Reverend Campbell, "This is DEL spending, not TME, which is total. Do you know nothing about fiscal economics? Bath University has an excellent economics department." This seemed to be nothing more than a desperate attempt by Andrew Neil to gloss over his own error and ignorance of economics, and done with a fair amount of brass neck and bombast, one has to say. But for all of his brassness, it doesn't actually help his original claim or make it correct. His claim that Scotland's budget is the same now as it was 7 or 8 years ago is still absolute bunk. It seems that Mr Neil has either been poorly advised or simply had one of these. To back up his claims, the BBC's top Scotland belittler presented this graph from the Scottish Government's budget report. On the surface, it does appear that each of the columns from 2008 to 2016 have more or less the same budget of around £35 billion. But appearances can be deceptive, and Andrew Neil, it seems, chose to deceive by not revealing the true nature of this particular graph, which he used to make his absurd claim to Angus Robertson in his Sunday Politics programme. In his keenness to show that Scotland's annual block grant had not been cut by the Tories, it seems that Andrew Neil overlooked a very important point about the graph he insists proves his point. Each sum depicted in Andrew Neil's graph as the total budget for each year actually has two parts to it. The larger of these two parts is what is known as the Departmental Expenditure Limit, or DEL. And this accounts for approximately 85% of the total. DEL is allocated by the Barnett formula, and the Scottish Government can choose to spend it however it wants. It's essentially the block grant which the Scottish Government has total control over. However, the remaining 15% of each total in Andrew Neil's graph is known as Annually Managed Expenditure, or AME, and this is used to cover spending funded directly by Westminster, for example on things like public sector pensions, and spending by councils financed from council tax or business rates. In summary, DEL is all the money the Scottish Government controls and has any say over spending, and reductions to DEL are what Fiscal Affairs Scotland meant when they said the Scottish budget had been cut by 10%. AME is not controlled by the Scottish Government and is not allocated by the Barnett formula. The Scottish Government cannot, for example, transfer money from AME to fund, for example, the NHS. Any policy decisions the Scottish Government makes have to be funded wholly from the DEL. Basically, AME is money that Holyrood has to administrate but can't actually choose what to do with. This money is earmarked by the UK Government to be spent on very specific things in Scotland. These two blocks of money can be thought of like this. Imagine two children each receive £2 pocket money per week. Now, because of household budget pressures, their pocket money has been reduced to £1 for each child per week. Now imagine you give £2 to one of the kids and tell them that the other £1 is to be given to his sister. The boy has received £2 and has it in his pocket just like he used to before his pocket money was cut. But he doesn't really have £2 because £1 of that money isn't actually his to spend. He is merely passing it on. He can totally decide how his own £1 will be spent. He has full control over that, but not the other £1 in his pocket which he has to administrate by passing it on to its rightful owner, his sister. So, because the boy at this point has £2 in his pocket, Andrew Neil is effectively telling the boy that he's not received any cut in his pocket money, that it's the same as it was before, which is totally untrue. Back to the drawing board, Mr. Neil. Do try to get your facts straight next time you try to belittle Scotland.